Can a river remember the names that were not written on deeds, only spoken into the cane when no overseer listened? Can a house learn the weight of the sins it shelters, so that even the nails dream of letting go? Can Christmas bells mask a storm that was sworn in whispers, patient as frost and older than the cypress? The winter of 1814 came down like a hush on the bend, hoarfrost along the rail fence, breath like smoke from the mules, the fields shorn to stubble and glittering with ice. Somewhere in that hush a vow moved quietly from one rib to the next. In the silence between one bell and another, the ledger turned. Before we enter the house and its long buried decks, pause with me. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigation. Now, step softly. The doors are swollen with cold. The candles are shivering in their dishes. The choir is lining up, and somewhere under the floor, a different hymn is waking. Winter on the Mississippi made the big river sound like a giant sleeping, breath low, steady, fog in the mornings that lifted in lace veils from the reeds. The plantation lay with its back to that breathing, a bright white house set on brick piers, its galleries bandaged in frost. The yard's iron bell wore a hoary fringe. The quarter day began before any bell. The kitchen door yawned first. The hearth glowed with banked embers coaxed to live again. A spoon tapped a copper pot like a muted metronome. Lard hissed, cornmeal sighed. The house, even while pretending to sleep, listened to its organs. Pantry, scullery, parlour wake and begin their daily pulse. Doors with swollen tongues were persuaded to move. Locks turned with little shoes of sound. Click and hush, click and hush. In the orchards, bluebirds flared against the grey like dropped scraps of sky. The orchard lad, breathing through his mittened hands, looked toward the river every hour as if it could deliver something other than cold. Hoofprints froze like black signatures. The cane trucks stood silent, their wheels furred in white. The overseer's whistle carved thin lines through the air. Up, down, up so sharp that the mules flicked their ears in their sleep. Inside the big house, rugs were beaten to release the ghosts of summer grit. A polished rag breathed the sting of spirits into the furniture. The sideboard shone back with a face stern and unblinking. The parlour clock mahogany body, brass hands, kept a steady sermon of seconds, relentless as a quarter whip. Each hour the small gilded cherub on its crest seemed to lean forward, willing the house to behave. They were preparing for winter mass, a plantation fashion, a private ceremony with invited neighbours. The master liked to adorn piety with sugar. Candles had been tallied, cedar and holly were threaded along the stair. The silver epergne in the dining room was fed with crystallized fruit that sparkled like court breath. The mistress rehearsed her smile in a small mirrored oval and scolded a housemaid for leaving fingerprints on the banister that the cold had already seized. In the quarters, a different rehearsal, fingers pricked by needles in the dim. Patchwork drawn tight without talk, children learning the discipline of being air. One old man lifted his eyes when he heard the choir from the big house practicing Venite, and his eyes turned river dark. He did not spit, he did not pray, he stitched a pocket shut so neatly that it looked like it had never been opened. The winter sun lived short. By late afternoon, shadows braided themselves in the galleries, and the gravel drive was a grey ribbon where carriage wheels would soon score their bright circles. The master's boots came and went, leaving the smell of tallow and cold iron. The mistress's perfume tried to make a summer in every room and failed. The house knew December. Floorboards groaned like old men remembering dances they were no longer allowed. The pealing bell at dusk drew labour to a spine of stillness. Men stood, hats in hands, women held their shawls close as if hugging their own shadows. The river exhaled fog across the stubble fields and made everything softer, almost tender, even the overseer's shadow. In that softened hour, a promise kept, walking around the edges of things, the skirts of fog, the hem of fields, the uneven lip of the well, and found its way to the steps of the big house, where wax cooled in its cups, where the clock rehearsed the hour to come. In the pantry, strings of onions hung like dull moons. A jar of lard wore a skin that a spoon might break with a sigh. Beside it, in quiet democracy, lay a coil of rough hemp, a tangle of seams waiting for daylight, a little pile of bent nails in a saucer that looked like black commas in a sentence the house had not yet finished. Neighbours arrived on the cold. Sleigh bells stitched laughter on top of frost. The men stamped their boots and approved the cedar garlands. The women removed gloves like shedding skins and tested the parlour chairs with watchful eyes. Children were corrected with whispers near the mouth, ghost words that would never warm. In the gallery's corner, a lanthorn shook its small, steady star. When the priest came, he wore Mississippi winter like a borrowed coat, stiff, unaccustomed. He touched the rail with a hand that had given bread to many and absolution to few. He looked at the house as if to remind it to comport itself. The house looked back in polished silence and kept its counsel. The quarters had already stopped singing. The mules had gone still. Somewhere a fox walked along the ditch with feet like writing. Mass would be at 7. After the dinner in which roast and talk would smoke together. After the clink and rinse of silver like a little river held in the scullery. After a hush like lifting a veil. The hour moved toward itself the way a river bends toward a whirlpool, and under the polished floor, under the cedar trim and the bowls of programmatic fruit, under the portrait with the flake in its varnish just at the corner of the youngest daughter's eye, something had already been laid, measure by measure, with the calm hands of winter. Benjamin learned silence the way children learn letters, by tracing shapes with a finger until touch memorized them. His mother had taught him to stitch, not for beauty, but for keeping things from spilling. A seam to hold a breath, a hem to keep a name from unravelling. When you cannot speak, she had told him once, eyes on a shirt cuff. You sew the world until it fits. He kept a ledger that no white man could read. It had no paper. It lived in the quiet place behind his tongue where words hardened into small stones. He set the stones in order. He numbered them with nights. Entry: the day his sister's child, born in harvest heat, was traded before the leaves showed colour. Entry: the time the overseer's stick found his back while he was crying a bucket that half spilled its water onto an ant trail, and he watched the ants swim in his shadow. Entry: the way the mistress had touched his cheek once, gentle as a mother, only to name that gentleness Charity and use it later as a story at dinner. Charity turned to a lid that sealed a pot. He was good with ash and water. He could coax lye from the cold hearts of burned wood and make soap that bit the air. He could set yeast to living even in winter. He could listen to the house and know where its bones ached. The parlour, for instance, complained of too many danced, a long groan at the centre joist, a sigh that ran to the south wall. The north gallery held its breath in froth to keep from splitting. The pantry door had a secret lift before you turn. Silence was not emptiness. Silence was a tool. In silence he learned the schedule of keys. He knew the mistress liked the ring to lie on its side on the marble, carefully so it wouldn't disfigure the stone with a crescent scar. He knew which keys freed which cupboards, and which kept the sugar from people who made the food. He knew the iron bell's rope could shred a palm if pulled too fast, and he knew the bell sometimes rang when no one pulled, if the wind came from the river with a story to tell. He counted the mass years like tree rings. 3 winters back, a girl from the quarters had sung a single line of "O come," too loudly. The mistress had flinched as if splashed by dirty water. That night, the girl's song was taken from her with the whop of a strap. The ledger received the entry without ink, and the next winter the priest had preached love, and the ledger listened and turned a leaf. Love preached like warm milk, and afterward the overseer signed the sale for a man whose name sounded like a cough. In summer, when the cane stood tall and insects wrote cursive in the air, Benjamin had imagined fire as a quick mercy with bright teeth. But winter taught him that fire could be trained to walk slowly, to count like the clock, to show up precisely at an appointed hymn. He learned from the way pine knots smouldered behind hickory in the hearth. He learned from the way wool remembered heat. He learned the stubbornness of ember, a red thought in ash. His hands had scars that were ordinances, a small white crescent at the base of his thumb from a blade that met him careless, a stipple along his palm from catching a kettle, a line across his knuckle from a nail hiding in rag. Each scar was a letter. The name spelled by those letters was not Benjamin, but something older that lived in his grandmother's stories about a river far away and a village that slept under trees shaped like umbrellas. He kept that older name folded and never spoke it. Silence was a bank, vowels drew interest. He never lifted his eyes too long to the master, who liked to be looked at the way weather likes to be obeyed. He learned the master's rhythm, how anger arrived like sudden summer rain, how the apology to God after was only thunder moving away and not the end of the storm. He learned the mistress's small cruelties, the smile that made refusal feel like grace. He learned the overseer's boredom and how boredom sharpened hunger. Asked no one because no one knew. When? Asked the frost every morning, and Benjamin did not answer. He measured patience with household tasks. He folded napkins into doves and thought about flight that is only ornament. He set knives at the right of plates and thought about the instructional alphabet of edges. He cut wick and turned it between his fingers as if braiding hair. He would never again be allowed to touch. He polished the lantern glass until it magnified flame into an eye. He did not hate the priest, he distrusted him. The priest moved through rooms like a man walking through fog with a bell. He hoped to be heard and forgiven for misunderstanding the ledger. Benjamin understood that the priest was a visitor in the ledger, appearing as a gentle ink that could be soaked out if a spill came. He neither relied on nor refused him. The ledger is not petty, it records. He had owed a debt once to a man in the quarters who taught him how to read weather from birds. When that man was sold downriver, Benjamin paid the debt by learning to negotiate with wind through the cracks in the big house. Wind, he discovered, was a clerk too, fast and meticulous, copying messages from river to rafters. If you set the right thread, if you set the right whisper, the wind would carry. The winter of 1814 sealed the book. News of war rode the river like a story with many versions. Militia boots clattered in Natchez. Rumours of British ships crawled up from New Orleans. Men argued about empire. Women counted jars. Somewhere a general was becoming a legend. On this bend, the legend Benjamin was composing had no drum. It had ash and thread and the slow arithmetic. He watched the cedar garlands wound along the banister and thought of Tinder dressed as holiday. He smelled the fresh scrubbed floors and thought of spirits that longed for a match. He noted the extra candles laid aside for the midnight mass and saw them as messengers waiting to be sent. He touched the bell rope and felt the winter in its twist. Entry, the year the master ordered the old woman to dance in the yard to prove her hip was not hurt. Entry, the child who looked at a mirror and thought the ghost in it was a friend because the friend would never be allowed. Entry, his own breath in the fields on a morning so cold it crystallized in his mustache like pennies turned to salt. Silence was his weapon. Silence sharpened him. He let the ledger close. He let the stones behind his tongue settle into a shape that was also a map. He slept with his hands open. He woke at the hour when the clock is forced to believe in itself, and in that hour he braided a fuse out of things that looked like nothing at all. He began in the scullery, where quiet work goes unnoticed by people who prefer the sound of their own plates. He rendered fat for candles and saved the dregs. the slick that clung to the bottom like a promise. He folded those remnants into cloth that no one would miss, habit making thrift look like obedience. He kept ash from the woodpile in a box and ground it with salt. The pantry offered him its slow language. There were burlap sacks that shed thread when moved. He twisted those threads with hair combed from brushes and made a line as thin as a river vein. He stole no key. He borrowed access by being the person who always had it. He learned which knot would slip only when asked by heat. He learned which rind burned longer than it deserved. In the mornings he visited the galleries with a bucket to dab at frost with warm water and prevent the boards from splitting, so he was told. He dabbed, and with his hand under the rag he left a smear of tallow where eye and glove would never find it, beneath railings, along the lip under the stair, at the seam where a column met its square base. Not so much that a candle set nearby would leap, only enough that when called, flame would remember the path as if it had practiced it in a dream. The bell rope, he touched it every day. He replaced a frayed section at the top with new hemp that he had patiently combed with lard. He let that conditioning sink in until the rope drank it like a thirsty throat. He watched the wind tug the rope's invisible end, high in the cupula, and imagined pulling it once, only once, at a chosen word. Rope does not love flame, but it respects it. Both answered. In the parlour he listened to the clock. He counted its solemn grace. He watched the mistress wind it every third evening, watched her lips purse around the effort. He had learned from a carpenter once that clocks can be bribed or betrayed with very small wedges. In the narrow hour before dawn, when he came to draw embers for the morning kitchen fire, he slid a sliver into the clock's case so that the chime would lag a minute, no more, on the night. A minute is a river in a house that believes time is its servant. Candles. He cut their wicks very precisely. A short wick works like a careful man, a long wick grows a mushroom of soot and spit. He cut for behaviour. Some he trimmed to almost nothing, so they would gutter and plead. Some he left generous, so they would throw their heads back and sing. He dipped 3 wicks, when no one saw, into that syrup of fat and salt, and let them dry as if born that way. A salted wick will talk louder when set near another talker. He walked the quarters with nothing in his hands. When women called him to taste stew, he tasted and smiled past hunger. When a child offered him a button found in the frost, he closed it in his palm and held its cold like a secret. He owed them carefulness not to call them into the book he was writing. Their protection was a boundary around the plot. He left no instruction. The plan would not use them. The plan was not a net that might catch a friend. He had a friend he could not spare, a mute carpenter with a twisted wrist who understood wood like the river understands banks. The carpenter had once leaned close and said, not with his mouth, but with the point of a knife tracing on a table, "There are 2 boards on the back stair that answer to each other." Benjamin nodded. He found those boards and learned their duet, the small release some feet offered if you put weight in a particular place. A secret step is a door that keeps no dog. 3 nights before Mass, he brought new candles to the dining room. He placed them in the silver sticks, and then, when the house slept, he switched 3 with cousins he had raised in a hidden corner of the scullery. Ordinary to eyes, exceptional to flame. He tucked a ribbon of oiled thread under the runner that ran the length of the table. He let its tail curl down the pedestal beneath, where the mistress never reached and the butler never looked because no one told him to. 2 nights before, he took a lantern to the gallery and checked the weather stripping he was told to check. He loosened a scrap near the north corner so that winter air would walk in as if invited. Flame and wind are cousins who love to talk too loudly at supper. He polished the lantern glass and imagined the moment it would magnify not light but decision. The night before, he sat in the quarters and listened to shoe talk, men trading for tobacco, for nails, women trading for buttons, for sleep that might remain theirs. He did not gamble. He watched the ice edge the eaves. He thought of his mother's seaming, how she taught that you hide the knot under the cloth and never let the outside show its beginning. He said nothing to the old man or to the child whose eyes were slick and honest as river stones. He kept the ledger's lock. On the day he rose with the frost, he carried wood without complaint. He polished silver until it grinned. He set the table with alignment that made God, if he looked, nod. He watched the mistress drift like a cloud that had decided to be merciful. He watched the master count his guests and decide that number was also holiness. He watched the overseer fidget because mass meant he could not wield anything but his eyes. If the plan failed, he would let it fail with him. If it worked, it would not forget him. He had placed a little tuft of cotton, the smallest shapeless lamb, in the scene behind the parlour curtains, where draught would feed it. He had tucked a pine knot like a sleeping coal near the baseboard, a knot that thirsted for a friend. He had traced pathways with vinegar to erase the human smell from his hands. He had taught himself to touch and leave no song behind. At 6, the dining room began its pageant. Laughter stuck lightly to the ceiling. Grease stamped its invisible fingers on the air. The salted wicks held steady. Benjamin moved in patterns that decades had taught, patterns so well rehearsed that any change would itself be a shout. He did not shout, he let the pattern carry him like a canoe carries a quiet man. At 7, Mass was called. Candles travelled from room to room like small passengers. People who had been cruelly warm to their own reflections now wrapped their piety like shawls. The priest took his place at a table repurposed as altar, its linen smooth as a lie told by someone practised. The parlour clock's cherub lifted his golden cheek to receive the hour. Benjamin, who had for a month been shaving seconds with a carpenter's, he stood near the bell rope in the hall, as if ready to signal the farm hands in the yard when the service ended. His hands were empty, his body knew the temperature of everything in the house, brass, wood, salt, his own blood. The oiled thread listened, curled under the runner like a thought at the edge of a mind. The pine knot pretended sleep, the cotton pretended innocence, the gallery draught and the candlewick cousins nodded to each other through a wall. When the priest's sleeve brushed the nearest stick, it trembled and recovered. The room exhaled and inhaled. The mistress lowered her eyes. The master half smiled the way a man does when he has trained even God to arrive on his schedule. The clock throat began to work. It asked to be 8. The wedge said no, wait, only a breath, only as long as it takes for someone beneath the floor to finish tying a knot that began 20 years ago. Benjamin drew the bell rope an inch and let it back. No peal, only the rope's soft complaint. In the parlour a salted wick leaned and met the tail of oiled thread with the courtesy of a kiss. The thread accepted. A hush passed through the house as wind found the loosened strip near the gallery and said, "Now I will help you speak." The first sound was not fire, it was thread waking to heat and humming, a sound so slight it might have been the priest's breath catching at the word mercy. Then the cotton tuft took the smallest ember into itself and glowed the way a secret glows under a rib. No flame yet, only a conviction. The draught bent its head to see better. The wick cousin, generous and grand, shed a bead of light like a tear. That tear fell and taught the runner how to learn. Benjamin felt the house notice. A house notices differently from a person. It feels through pressure, through the change in conversation between wood and winter. The parlour boards stiffened, the gallery tasted a sweetness it remembered from summer's tar. The clock, whose hour had been delayed like a train howled outside a station, pushed its chime into the room just as the first thin flame found the hem of the curtain, and drew a line there like a signal. Flame writes fast once it finds paper, taught to behave. The hem darkened, went to lace, went to mouth, then to speech. The curtain lifted its own edges and became a prayer book set on fire. Someone gasped, "No word, only air." The mistress turned, and her face learned what a house looks like when it decides it has had enough history. The priest lifted his hand. The master said a name that was not God. Benjamin pulled the bell rope once. The bell outside yelped, a small sound, as if surprised into truth. In the quarters, heads lifted. In the yard, a mule stamped but did not move. The ground was iron with cold. Inside, the runner's long tongue carried flame to the table's belly. The pine knot woke with joy like a sinner promised a last dance. The draught from the gallery ran into the room like a cousin arriving late to a funeral. The house did not scream at first. It tried to negotiate. Smoke drew itself thin along the ceiling like a tight ribbon. The silver on the sideboard shone with someone else's weather. The portrait's flaked varnish at the youngest daughter's eye made it appear she was crying. The priest said, "Stay calm," and calm was not invited. Calm had lived in the pocket of a woman taken across water. When the first board popped, a sharp report like a knuckle cracked by a man failing to hold his temper. People moved. Chairs scraped. The mistress reached for a candle and thought foolishly to beat fire with fire. The master shouted for the overseer, whose eyes had already become two little moons tugged by a strange tide. The curtain fell, half consumed, and the parlour learnt how to be a forest again. Things leaned toward light and then fell away, and the air was no longer a gentle. Benjamin did not run. He stepped backward into the hall, where the draughts were his friends. Smoke found the stair and began to argue with it. Cedar garlands offered themselves like saints who discovered their bones still burned. Each knot in the banister became a little throat shouting through flame. The bell outside gathered courage and threw its voice. Once, twice, until the yard's dark answered with running feet. Neighbours held handkerchiefs to their mouths and became good people in a hurry, calling God and looking for water. There is never water enough in a house that has stored only shine. Buckets are always small, lungs are always smaller. The priest took off the linen from the table and smothered one bright fox of flame. 3 others laughed and ran along the baseboard where tallow memory waited, fateful as a dog. The clock, betrayed by a wedge and by justice, began to ring the hour as if to make official. 8 struck like a gavel. The house entered its testimony. Someone shouted children, and 2 little ones were carried out with hair smelling of cedar smoke and sugar. The mistress sobbed and slapped at sparks that had fallen on her shawl like bad news. The master lunged toward a cabinet that had once kept ledgers of cotton bales and debts and men, and found that the cabinet now kept only heat. He swore at the flame, and it did not stop to be offended. It is the nature of judgment not to manage the offender's feelings. Benjamin moved where his plan had told him he would. He pulled once more on the bell to call hands from the quarters to the yard, not to fight, but to witness. The overseer saw him and saw through him and saw nothing. In the yard, old men who knew fire's genealogy shook their heads slowly. Women gathered children into shawls. The mule turned and looked at the house as if it had finally brayed something he understood. The draught drew a long breath. The gallery lit along its underside where the invisible smear had waited all week, polite as a servant called by name. A ribbon of flame ran it like a child. Columns brightened at their cuffs. The front door, which had been taught to be aristocratic, bowed deeply, wood softening into a curtsy, and then coughed out, black. The priest found Benjamin in the hall, eyes streaming not from sorrow but from smoke. "Help me with the water," he shouted, as if volume could bargain with design. Benjamin took the bucket and carried it faithfully, and threw it faithfully, and missed, faithfully because flame is quick and knows to move where water thinks it will be. He did right by the priest. The ledger kept that entry too. When the roof found the heat it had been promised, it surrendered with a great tired moan. It sounded like an old man standing from a low chair. Sparks leapt like a flock of starlings. The cedar garlands turned from holiday to history, collapsing in ash that dusted the stair with grey lace. The portrait's eyes were 2 small holes burned through varnish into some kind of dark. The master, he saw Benjamin, just a labourer, a quiet one, the man with the good hands, and for a moment the master's face cracked open into a child's, pleading with a stranger at a flood. Benjamin set the bucket down. his palms were wet and smelled of iron. He looked at the house and thought not triumph, but a closing of a book whose last line has been waited on for decades. He saw the river beyond the yard, very black, and the sky above it very cold, and felt for a heartbeat his mother's fingers turning a hem and knotting it under the cloth where no one could see. The bell rang once more, as if to count the house's souls. No one had told the bell to stop. It spoke anyway. By morning, Frost and Ash were married. The big house sat like a tooth rotted to the gum, chimneys upright, everything between them a charcoal sermon. The river looked on without comment. Crows came, because crows love a story told in smoke. The neighbours drifted home on their sleighs with faces not yet decided they would choose, in their kitchens, whether they had been brave or nearly so. Newspapers travelled slowly. When they came, they blamed negligence, then providence, then an unlucky wind. They printed phrases that sounded learned, conflagration, accident, act of God, and stretched them like clean sheets over a bed where the dead had not finished lying down. A column in Natchez sighed about the state of morals, then broke for an advertisement selling a girl who was good with needles. Stories disagreed about who rang the bell. Some said it pulled itself, horror making the iron nervous. Some said a man no one knew came out of the river and pulled thrice before returning to the fog. A child swore she saw a flame sit like a bird on the priest's hand and not burn him. Another child said the portrait cried real tears, and his mother shushed him and later told the same story to her cousin with a different child. The overseer's hand shook when he wrote the inventory of what was left. He listed a sideboard whose feet were now coal, a pianoforte delirious with weather, a clock face cracked through the cherub's cheek as if time had slapped it. He did not list the ledger that had always been kept elsewhere, with no paper and no pen. In the quarters, women picked through the ashes with sticks and found spoons that had all turned the same colour. Honest. Men looked at the black, grimmed ribs of the house and nodded to each other in the way that says a sentence without risking it. Children carried home lumps of charcoal and drew on raw boards the shape of windows now empty, and those drawings looked like mouths open to sing. No one's name was said aloud beside the fire at night. The fire spoke enough. A rumour rode the river. It said the house had burned during Mass as judgment for pride. It said a man had planned it for years using nothing but kitchen scraps and winter and a patience learned from women who make seams. It said the bell had rung itself hoarse, announcing that some debts are paid, not with coins but with heat. Rumour made room for the priest, who had tried and almost succeeded at saving a page. Rumour let the mistress live, because rumour knows a better punishment is sometimes to count. The master's hand, unaccustomed to empty, closed on air for weeks. He supervised the farm from a chair carried to the yard because walls now made him flinch. He spoke of rebuilding with larger bricks and a wider gallery and a better bell. He sent letters to cousins with money who sent back concerns about war and grain. He stood once by the river and lifted his hat to keep ash from his eyes, and found that his hands shook when there was no audience for their steadiness. As for Benjamin, he became less visible, like a name that knows when to turn sideways and pass through a crowd. He carried water. He split wood with strokes so even they could have been a metronome. He rubbed a child's back when coughing took him. He mended a coat so neatly that the tear forgot itself. The priest watched him once from a distance and could not decide what he was seeing. The priest wrote in his private book, "There is a man here whose silence feels like prayer." He crossed out prayer and wrote weather. No one accused. That was the winter's strange courtesy. The master dared not. He needed hands. The overseer suspected everyone and therefore no one. The mistress learned to startle at any smell of smoke, bread, lamp, even laundry near the hearth. The quarters did what quarters do, became experts at the art of appearing in the right place at the wrong time, only for small things, and never for the thing itself. At night the bend was quieter. A house on fire is also a song, and when the song is over, the ears ring. Dogs whined in their sleep. The river, unlit, carried the story downstream to Baton Rouge, where it traded truth for speed, and then to New Orleans, where it put on perfume and learned to dance. By spring, someone had set the tale in a tavern with fiddles. By summer, someone had moved the year to make it rhyme better. But here, the blackened bricks warmed daily under new sun. Here the iron bell became pious again, ringing for small things, calves born, rain promising itself from the west, the distant news that peace had been signed. The bell's tongue hung with the knowledge of another liturgy. It slept as badly as old men after war. Benjamin passed it and did not touch it. The bell did not know whether to thank him. He added no triumph to the ledger. He wrote nothing there at all. He went where work called and answered in the language of tasks. Yes to the bucket, yes to the gate, yes to the hinge that needed oil. On Sundays he sat with the old man and learned more about birds. Silence went on doing its work, which is to keep certain shapes from uncovering themselves to teeth that had not earned them. The master tried once to reorder the world. He rode to Natchez to buy a clock and came home with a smaller one that insisted on chiming the half hours, as if reminding a man of his fractions. He placed it on a table in a cabin the family would occupy while rebuilding. The clock chimed at night like a stray lamb. He hated it for telling truth in pieces, and took to covering it with a cloth. Time, like smoke, found its way out. Winter receded, the ash mixed with spring mud and made the garden dark and friendly to beans. Women planted with hands that remembered fire and decided to feed themselves anyway. Men laid new sills for a small storehouse, not because they wished to serve another house again, but because wood deserved at least one honest life. Children learned to read the black dust off their own palms and see not shame but carbon and stars. Rumour slept, stories never sleep. Years later, when the river had carried away the names of generals and left only the mood of their traffic, people on the bend still talked about the winter mass. They had made it a shrine in their mouths, complete with inventions that made sense to those who needed them. A woman swore the priest had sprinkled holy water that turned to steam and formed letters in the air. She could not say which letter. She did not need to. A man insisted the portrait's eyes had followed him across the yard and into his sleep until he took down his own looking-glass and put it away. Children brought friends to the brick stumps and told them to listen. If you put your ear to the right brick, they said, you can hear a bell ring once, soft as a finger on your lips. The right brick changed every time, because the game was belief and not geology. They took turns hearing it. The crows, faithful congregants, watched from the fence and made words no one could translate. Benjamin grew old without becoming a story in his own mouth. He refused that hunger. He lived as men live who have learned to work without witnesses. His hair went iron grey and then ash white. He took in a boy who needed mending and taught him the patient seams, the hidden knot, the turned hem, the stitch you cannot see that holds the world from spilling. When the boy asked about the night he had heard a bell ring with no hand on it, Benjamin smiled like river fog taking back the shore at dawn. The house burned, he said, because many small things remembered the same promise at the same time. The boy waited for more. There was no more. The priest, now an old man with hands that confessed arthritis before they confessed trespasses, wrote one last line regarding the bend. There was a fire that did not destroy us, it revealed us. He closed his book and put it where the rats could not eat it, because even truth deserved a dry place. When he died, they rang the bell 3 times, and on the 3rd a wind came from the river that smelled faintly of cedar and old wick. People looked at each other and said nothing. The master's children built a smaller house upriver. It tried to be modest and failed. It never kept winter the same way, and its galleries were quieter because cedar garlands felt ominous now. No one there spoke of the old house unless to say, that time. They made piety into carefulness. They locked fewer doors, not because they trusted, but because wood remembers heat differently after judgment. A portrait in the new dining room watched nothing and learned nothing. The old bricks sank slowly into the generous earth. Beans had once loved their ash, now moss loved their shade. Wild violets came with April and made little astonishments. People brought catechisms of other griefs to lay there. The name of a son who'd quit the river and written back only once. The name of a daughter who'd married a tally and found herself subtracted. The place accepted all this like a ledger that had grown wise and soft. It recorded, but it did not demand payment. Sometimes a traveller in winter would pass at dusk and see, along the line where the gallery had once run, a low brightness as if frost were remembering flame. He would tug his hat down and ride faster because certain sights are invitations, and some men know when not to RSVIP. He would tell the story that night at the inn and add a thing or two, maybe a chant, maybe a face in the window of a house that had no windows now. The story did not scold him for this. Legends are generous with borrowing. As for the bell, children grew into adults who knew better, and still, on cold Sundays, heard a small iron voice clearing its throat. When the wind was right, it sounded like one word, enough. On other days it sounded like two. Not yet. The bell had a liturgy it kept to itself. In late life, Benjamin walked to the river at dawn. He listened to the big water breathe. He put his hand on a cypress and felt time moving in both directions. He thought of his mother's seam, of the hidden knot, of heat married to patience. He thought of the ledger that owed him nothing now, because a page had once caught fire in just the right place. He had not been made free by this world's writing, but he had written something the world could not erase. One winter morning, cold enough to remember 1814 by scent alone, he sat on a stump where the back stair had once whispered to a quiet friend, and he chose to close his eyes for a while. A fox went along the ditch with the cautious feet of a scribe. The river exhaled a long woolen breath. Somewhere upriver a clock tried to strike a half hour with courage, and failed. In the quiet he felt a weight lift that was not his body. A child came later and found his footprints in frost, leading to the stump and nowhere else. The child ran to the quarters and the story ran faster. They laid him out with the care he had taught them for seams. They did not speak about the house. They did not need to. When the bell rang once, only once, crows rose from the naked pecan trees and drew a black sentence in the air, a sentence whose grammar every living thing understands and no one can translate. On certain nights, if you stand where the parlour was and let the winter enter your coat like an old truth, you can still feel a warmth that is not from the sun. It is not heat and it is not memory. It is the shape of judgment after it has slipped its chains and learned to walk like a man. The ledger is unfinished. The page is singed at the corner, yes, but there are lines enough for all our names. The bell sleeps. The river remembers. The house that was is a rumour in the tongues of frost. And somewhere, behind the ribs of the land, a seam holds, hidden knot, patient thread, waiting for the hour that will always, always come. Leave a comment if you hear the bell.